Welcome, greetings to all of you joining us today from wherever you are joining us. I'm Arthur Urbano, president of the International Catacomb Society. And on behalf of the members of the board of directors, I'd like to welcome you to today's panel featuring three recent recipients of the Shohet Scholars Grant. I'm here with Nicola Denzi-Lewis, who is a vice president in the Catacomb Society, and we have several other members of the ICS board with us today. We're really pleased today to showcase the research of the three talented scholars we have with us, Gregory Given and Rebecca Harris, who are part of the 2021 cohort, and Rachel Patt, who was part of the 2022 cohort of Shohet Scholars. The Shohet Scholars Grant is named for the founder of the ICS, Estelle Shohet Bretman, who founded the ICS in 1980 with the goal of promoting the preservation, restoration, and documentation of the Jewish and Christian catacombs in Rome and elsewhere. The Shohet Grant program was established in 2001 to further these goals. Each year, the ICS selects and supports one or more Shohet scholars with an award ranging from $2,000 to $30,000. The primary intent of the grant is to support significant innovative research that is consistent with Estelle's vision. Shohet scholars do their research in a variety of fields: archaeology, art history, classics, history, comparative religions, and so on. The work need not focus explicitly on the Roman catacombs, as we will see today, but it should be within the sphere of the Mediterranean world from the late Hellenistic period to the end of the Roman Empire. The ICS is especially interested in interdisciplinary projects that approach traditional topics from new perspectives. If you'd like more information on the grant program, you can go to our website, www.catacombsociety.org. And you can send any questions you have about the program to shohetics@gmail.com, and I'll put some of that information in the chat in a moment. So now let's get to our presentations. I'll introduce each speaker in turn before they speak. We've asked them to speak for about 15 to 20 minutes each. And then after all three have presented, we'll have some time for Q&A. So we would just ask you to use the chat for your questions and feel free to post them there at any time during the presentations. And then when we get to the Q&A, which Nicola will be moderating, we can get to your questions there. All right, so let's get started. Our first presenter is Greg Given. Greg received a Shohet Grant in 2021. He teaches first-year writing seminars in Harvard College, and when enrollments and administrators allow, Coptic language at Harvard Divinity School. He's previously taught at the University of Virginia, University of Mary Washington, Stonehill College, and Yale Divinity School. His increasingly interdisciplinary research spans the history of early Christianity, the literary culture of the Greek East, of the ancient Mediterranean, manuscript studies, and the history of early modern scholarship. But his primary writing project at the moment is the initial contract for the Harvard Academic Workers Union, for which he is a proud member of the bargaining committee. His project today is titled Open Letters, Ignatius of Antioch, and the Reconstruction of Early Christianity. Greg, you have the floor.
Let's see. My screen is doing something very strange now. Everybody can see my presentation, yes?
Yes.
Good.
Yeah.
All right, wonderful, wonderful. Well, I'm immensely grateful for the invitation to participate in this panel, and even more so, of course, for the generous support of the Catacomb Society over the 2021-2022 academic year. While I am, of course, here to share the outcomes of this research that was supported by this award, I'd be remiss if I didn't take just a couple of minutes at the beginning of my time here to articulate the personal and professional significance this grant held for me. News of the award arrived in April of 2021, towards the tail end of an academic year in which I had been adjuncting, teaching 6 courses across 4 different institutions, while also working as a freelance editor and a private tutor in Greek. In that very same month when Anavis emailed me to share the news of the award, I had been polishing up my resume, looking for work outside of academia, wondering how I'd ever have time to make any progress on my book project. And it's no exaggeration to say that the Shohet Award was a lifeline for my early research career. It kept me tethered to this field at a moment when I was starting to drift away. And when I was fortunate enough to start a new faculty position later that year, teaching these first-year writing seminars here at Harvard, it allowed me to hold open some time for my research that most of my colleagues don't have, because many of us take up opportunities to teach additional courses in the evenings or in the summer and winter terms for supplemental income. And I want to emphasize,
if I may add
yeah,
anything,
please.
I remember that you wrote me a letter, an email. Are you sure that I don't have to do anything more than just do my research? For and I'm so happy that it really worked well for you.
Well, yeah, and I think that actually is exactly what I wanted to emphasize here. I mean, the reason that the Shohet Award could play the role that it played for me is because of the lack of restrictions upon how the award can be used. It's exceedingly rare among funding opportunities in the humanities in the United States that you have a grant that is open to independent scholars. It requires no travel or relocation. It requires no specific commitment from a host institution, no course releases or workload adjustments. And that flexibility was what allowed me to take on this award and allowed me to do the research that I'm going to share about today. And so it's a feature of the award that I will sing, I sing its praises whenever and wherever I can, because it's a feature of this grant that I think should be cherished and maintained and should indeed serve as a model for other institutions funding research in the humanities. So now to actually say something about my research, the Shohet Award supported my monograph project, which is provisionally titled, as you see here, Open Letters, Ignatius of Antioch and the Reconstruction of Early Christianity. This monograph project arises from what has turned out to be a fairly extensive revision and expansion of my dissertation project. And it focuses, perhaps obviously, on the letters attributed to Ignatius, the Bishop of Antioch, who, as tradition holds, was martyred in the Roman arena during the reign of the Emperor Trajan in the early decades of the 2nd century. Now, if any of you have ever encountered Ignatius of Antioch in research or in a class or in a church context, it was almost certainly through the paracanonical collection of early Christian texts known as the Apostolic Fathers. In this collection, you will invariably find 7 letters attributed to Ignatius, 7 listed here on the slide. These letters paint a picture of desperate circumstances. Ignatius is being conveyed to Rome, clad in chains and guarded by soldiers, bound for execution by the jaws of beasts. Along this grim journey, he somehow has the wherewithal to write a number of letters to Christian communities around Asia Minor. If, as tradition holds, these letters were composed around the beginning of the 2nd century, they represent the earliest evidence for the desire of a martyr's death in imitation of Christ, the earliest evidence for bishops' regional authority over other local church leaders, the earliest evidence even for the abstract noun Christianismos, Christianity. So the 7 letters of Ignatius, available to readers in modern editions, like these Apostolic Fathers editions, have played a really foundational role in scholars' reconstruction of early Christianity. They would appear to function as stable orientation points for plotting the development of early church practices and the dating of New Testament texts. This 7-letter collection, however, is the product of modern scholarship and modern print culture. Late ancient and medieval manuscripts transmit a wide variety of Ignatian letter collections, ranging from 3 letters to 17, attesting to a fairly dramatic textual fluidity in transmission. 7 letters of Ignatius are mentioned by Eusebius. The 7 letters that are now transmitted in Apostolic Fathers print editions are the ones mentioned by Eusebius. But even the letters that Eusebius mentions exist in multiple versions across this manuscript tradition. And there is no Greek manuscript, except for one very curious and telling exception that I'll speak more about in a few minutes, that transmits only the 7 letters known to Eusebius. So the book project begins from the observation that what you're seeing now, this transmission across all of these different versions, is a much more complicated picture than the threefold recension model that has been the kind of consensus understanding of the textual history of these letters over the past century or so. In fact, my first published research output arising from the Shohet Scholarship was devoted to illustrating precisely this point with respect or with special reference to the 2 extant Coptic versions of these letters, which display textual features that are especially difficult to reconcile to that traditional threefold recension model that has been the consensus understanding of the textual history of these letters, like I said, for over a century now. So the book project is trying to address 2 questions which I believe to be closely intertwined. First, how and why did this threefold recension model arise? How did we get from this complexity to this simplicity? And how can we read the letters of Ignatius in a manner that's more attentive to their pre-modern transmission, more attentive to whatever is going on in this, sort of wild multiplicity? My answers to both of these questions are still very much works in progress, but the other published results thus far of my Shohet Scholarship year represent expeditions, at least in the direction of answers to that second question. How do we read the letters of Ignatius in a manner more attentive to their pre-modern transmission? So in addition to this publication on the Coptic versions of the letters of Ignatius, I published a new translation and a critical introduction to the correspondence of Ignatius with John the Evangelist and the Virgin Mary, which survives in the Latin versions of the letters of Ignatius, as well as a brief exploratory essay experimenting with reading the long recension of the letters of Ignatius in Greek, within the genre of the ancient epistolary novel, or as epistolary fiction. And then I do still have one piece forthcoming that's arising still from the work that I did back in 21 and 22, Epistolary Networks, Transmission and Flux in Ancient Letter Collections, which is an essay forthcoming in a Brill volume that's in dialogue with Judith Liu's Radboud Prestige lectures that she delivered a couple of years ago. This essay is trying to reckon with the textual fluidity of ancient letter collections more broadly. Considering how the letters of Ignatius are not really unique in this regard. In fact, the kind of fluidity that we see in the transmission of the letters of Ignatius is something much closer to the norm than the exception in the transmission of ancient letter collections. What I want to share today is more of what is not available out there in print. If anybody wants to read any of these things that I've published or that I'm soon to publish, you're welcome to email me and I'm happy to share those. But I thought it would be more interesting to share what is still yet to be worked out, what's still the kind of work in progress here. And that is my attempts to address the first question, that question of how did this model, this threefold recension model arise? This question has proven quite difficult to answer. It's a question that has transformed me into an accidental amateur early modernist, and it's made this project difficult to bring to any sort of a satisfactory completion, because it turns out that answering this question entails a close study of a succession of scholarly, ecclesiastical, and political controversies from the 16th to 19th centuries in Europe. It's my hunch, and in my ongoing research, I'm working on substantiating this hunch, that perennial attempts to fix the letters of Ignatius are a crucial but underappreciated through line in the history of philology. The specific transmissional dynamics of the corpus, as well as the ideological and theological issues that intersect with these letters, demanded constant engagement as philological and historical critical methods developed and indeed may even have quietly driven some of those developments in these methods, betwixt and between the more prominent perennial cases, your Homer, Hebrew Bible, and of course the New Testament. And so it's just one small piece of this story that I want to share today. In 17th century England, the textual criticism of the letters of Ignatius was arguably a matter of life and death. To understand why, it's perhaps best to start with this fellow here, King James I, who from the very beginning of his reign had some troubles. A group of Protestant reformers who had been dubbed Puritans by their opponents applied consistent and increasingly intense pressure to complete the reformation of the English Church by, among other things, abolishing the episcopacy. The king called a conference in January of 1604, bringing together small committees of bishops and Puritan leaders in an attempt to reach a compromise. Particularly at issue was the status of the bishop. The Puritans drew on the arguments of continental reformers, especially John Calvin, who noted that there seemed to be no distinction in the sacred scriptures between the bishop or episkopos, overseer, and the presbyter or elder. Armed with this observation, English reformers pushed for a return to the apostolic Presbyterian form of Christian worship and church governance. Bishops then simply had to go. So at this 1604 conference, the king famously flew into a rage that he maybe had kind of staged and uttered this line that would become a maxim for his defense of the English episcopacy: "No bishop, no king." He saw in the Puritans' demand to abolish episcopacy a direct challenge to his monarchical authority. If the supervisory role of the bishop was no longer considered an office ordained by divine right, God's backing of the monarch would soon fall under the same scrutiny. No bishop, no king. Of course, while the circumstances that ultimately precipitated the English Civil Wars are complex and have as much to do with taxation as they do with episcopacy, James's maxim was nevertheless prescient. In 1645, in the midst of war between king and parliament, William Laud, the Archbishop of Canterbury, was beheaded on parliamentary order in defiance of a royal pardon. A year later, Parliament formally abolished episcopacy, root and branch, as the bill was called. And in January of 1649, Charles himself met with the headsman's axe. No bishop, no king, indeed. As the earliest witness to the bishop's office, the letters of Ignatius were the crucial proof text for defending the legitimacy of the episcopacy throughout this bloody conflict. Already in the 15th and 16th centuries, early printed editions of Ignatius's letters met with rising reformist incredulity as to their authenticity and textual integrity. This was an era in which the famous popish forgeries like the Donation of Constantine or the Corpus of Dionysius the Areopagite were being gleefully unmasked. The letters of Ignatius, which were printed alongside the Corpus of Dionysius in several early important early editions, fell under a similar skepticism. John Calvin, for example, claimed that there were obvious corruptions and anachronisms in Ignatius's text, decrying the vile absurdities circulating under his name. In 1641, amidst the escalating controversy over bishops in England, a young John Milton raged anonymously that the letters of Ignatius must either be adulterate or else Ignatius was not Ignatius, nor a martyr, but most adulterate and corrupt himself. In the midst, therefore, of so many forgeries, where shall we fix to dare say this is Ignatius? As for his style, who knows it, so disfigured and interrupted as it is? To what end should they cite him as authentic for episcopacy when they cannot know what is authentic in him? Such critiques stimulated increasingly urgent attempts to fix the letters of Ignatius. And I use the word fix here simultaneously in two senses, both to repair something that is broken and to firmly attach or anchor something. For the text critical project of repairing the broken text of the letters of Ignatius was understood in this era to in turn repair or redeem the letter's authenticity, to affix the author Ignatius, and thereby the office of episcopacy, to a secure anchorage in the early 2nd century. One rather crude possible attempt we can see at fixing the letters of Ignatius is this Greek manuscript that now resides in the Bodleian Library. that would astonishingly seem to preserve only the 7 letters known to Eusebius. This manuscript, however, seems to have been copied in the 17th century, likely in England after controversies were already well underway. And moreover, it clearly relies upon a 16th century printed edition. Now, this wouldn't stop John Pearson, an important later 17th century English divine, from claiming this manuscript as important new evidence for the authenticity of the Ignatian letters, but that's another part of the story for another day. Milton addresses his histrionic treatise to one prominent churchman who had used Ignatius extensively in his own defense of episcopacy's apostolic origins, this Irish Archbishop James Ussher. Unbeknownst to Milton, at the very time that he was railing against Ussher, Ussher had already found an answer to where he would fix to dare say this is Ignatius in Ussher's account of what is authentic among his letters, and printing of Ussher's answer to that question was in fact already underway as Milton was writing. In the interest of time, I think I will skip ahead a little bit here, just simply noting in passing that James Ussher had been drafted into this controversy over the episcopacy in England and had written several treatises in defense of this office of episcopacy. These treatises were what stimulated Milton's response. But in the process of writing those treatises, Ussher had discovered in Cambridge and then soon found another copy of a Latin manuscript in England that represented a version of the letters of Ignatius that seemed to align with how the letters of Ignatius have been quoted by Theodoret. And this was a version that was different than the texts of the letters of Ignatius that were then available in Greek. Ussher then printed the reconstructed text based on this discovery in 44. And it's a few peculiar features of this edition that I want to just comment on really briefly here in closing. Another manuscript discovery in 17th century England set important precedents for how Ussher framed his discovery of a new version of the letters of Ignatius. In 1628, Cyril Lucaris, the Patriarch of Constantinople, gifted Charles I an ancient biblical codex and a belated expression of gratitude for James I's support of Cyril before the Ottoman Sultan. This manuscript, which we now know as Codex Alexandrinus, a lavish parchment uncial evidently copied in the 5th century, of course, now still resides in the British Library. In the final folia of this manuscript, the codex includes a letter from Clement, 1st century Bishop of Rome, familiar to many, if not all in this audience, I'm sure, followed by fragments of a second letter also attributed to Clement. While Clement's letters had previously been known through patristic quotations, the arrival of Alexandrinus in Britain marked European scholars' first access to the text that came to be known as First Clement. An edition of the Greek text with a Latin translation was prepared by Patrick Young and published at Oxford in 1633. As Young's text is a diplomatic edition of a single manuscript, lacunae in the vellum require Young to fill in missing letters, words, and phrases to round out the complete usable text. Young's conjunctures are printed in red ink, a rare extravagance in the hand press era. Young highlights this distinctive feature in his prefatory address to readers as a technological innovation, a new and unusual type of printing. And the effect on the page of the contrasting color is a vivid and instantly clear distinction between the words present in the manuscript and those supplied by the editor. By literally highlighting the editor's hand, the red letters render transparent the scholarly work of producing the edition, rhetorically narrowing the gap between the majestic ancient manuscript and the diminutive printed octavo. The black ink of the extant text then implicitly stands as all the more ancient and authoritative. The rhetorical power of this use of miniated letters in the context of English political disputation is apparently confirmed by the mimicking of Young's textual presentation in a pamphlet published by Symonds Jews in London in 1641 as part of the same flurry of print disputation over the status of the bishop to which Milton and Ussher were contributing. Jews was a member of the Long Parliament who apparently delighted in showing off his antiquarian knowledge among his less well-educated colleagues. As a pugilist for the anti-episcopacy side, Jews found valuable evidence in a different section of Codex Alexandrinus, the postscripts of the pastoral epistles. Here, as he explained in a speech to Parliament and the readers of this pamphlet, the ecclesiastical titles for Timothy and Titus received in the Greek text of the New Testament, Timothy, the first bishop of Ephesus, and Titus, the first bishop of Crete, are absent in Codex Alexandrinus. And this proved, on Jews' account, that they are the bold, spurious additions of some Eastern bishop or monk, I'm quoting, of course, here, to the postscripts of those epistles of St. Paul at least 500 years after Christ. He then translates the full text of those postscripts in all capital letters, mimicking the Greek uncials. The first letter to Timothy written from Laodicea, the second to Timothy written from Laodicea, to Titus written from Nicopolis. On the next page, he then presents, as you can see here, in parallel columns, a transcription of the postscripts out of Alexandrinus, and then a translation of alongside the received texts, what was known then in the printed editions of the New Testament, with the spurious editions of later times set down in red or miniated letters. So note here that Jews is inverting what Mimic has done, or what Young has done in his use of miniated texts. Instead of the red letters signifying scholarly erudition, the conjectural filling out of lacunae, here it signals interpolation, what should be excised from the received text. This brings me finally back to Ussher's edition. Instead of simply printing the new, shorter Latin version of the letters that he had discovered, he presents the previously known received Greek and Latin texts in parallel columns. And as you can see here in the Greek texts, he prints all of the words and sentences that do not correspond to his newly discovered text in red ink. Ussher then appends the full shorter Latin text only at the very end of the collection, marking their words and phrases that do not appear in the received Greek text in square brackets. This latter editorial choice is especially significant as it means that for the moment, potentially genuine Ignatian material that he had recently discovered remained invisible in the main body of the Greek text. Had Ussher simply published a new text of the letters of Ignatius, his discovery could have easily been co-opted for the purposes of those denying the validity of the corpus. After all, since their arguments relied upon the simple fact of variation among extant texts, the existence of an additional new version could have furnished more rhetorical fodder. But what Ussher does instead is provided scholars with the same text that they already knew, but with certain passages flagged in red ink now as newly doubtful, making the exact same inversion of Young's use of red ink as Jews in the postscripts of the pastoral epistles. New variants that might otherwise suggest additional scribal intervention remain safely buried in a separate part of the volume. In making these formatting choices, Ussher drew attention to the fact of textual variants, but with the explicit claim that earlier and later, and thus better and worse texts, could be sorted out by scholarly inquiry. The corrupted text of Ignatius could be fixed. The authoritative author of Ignatius could thereby be redeemed. I think I will leave it there because I realize I'm already way over time. Thank you all for your patience and attention.
All right, thank you so much, Greg. We've already got some questions coming into the chat, so if anybody else has any questions for Greg, please put them there, and we'll get to the Q&A after we've gone through all the papers. So our next presenter is Rebecca Harris. Rebecca also received a Shohet in 2021. She's been Assistant Professor of Biblical and Religious Studies at Messiah University since 2019. In addition to her work on the Dead Sea Scrolls, Rebecca's research interests include early Jewish pseudepigrapha and apocryphal literature. Her most recent work considers the function of birth and maternal imagery in 4 Maccabees. Rebecca's presentation today is titled Living in the Liminal, the Present as a Place of Access in Qumran Literature. Okay, Rebecca, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you. Go ahead and share my screen. Okay. Right, well, good afternoon. Thank you so much for the introduction, Arthur. I'm grateful to be here with all of you today, and I'm especially grateful to have been awarded this generous grant. It actually came at a really pivotal time for me as an early career scholar, navigating a new academic position during COVID with a 4-4 teaching load and having 2 small children. The grant afforded me valuable time to work on pieces of the project that I get to share with you today. This project has been a long time in the making, so it's been really fun and rewarding to finally see the pieces come together, a lot of it just this past year. The ideas for this project grew out of an interest in Qumran liturgical material and the group's constructions of time and space. Something about the ecstatic worship in the songs of the Sabbath sacrifice, the apocalyptic dualism of the war scroll, and the spirit language of the Hodayot captivated my interest. In some ways, it seemed almost familiar, resembling aspects of my own Pentecostal upbringing. There was a realness to these images of human divine communion and otherworldly experience that I wanted to understand, and they seemed to be wrapped up in the group's ideas about time and space. So in the next few minutes, I hope to show how the group's constructions of time and space can help us better understand Qumran liturgical practices. Including the belief that communion with angels was already a present reality and that certain worshipers might become incorporated into the heavenly realm and permanently join the ranks of divine beings. At its core, this project is concerned with religious experience, which can be particularly difficult to explain, especially when it concerns the experiences of a group that existed 2,000 years ago. However, I think one of the advantages in relation to the Qumran group is that we have both material and literary remains. While the scrolls themselves attest to the group's ideas and beliefs, the remains at Khirbet Qumran offer a parallel witness to how members of the group might have lived out these beliefs. The concept of liminality also plays an important role in my work. Of reconstructing the religious experiences and aspirations of the Qumran group, and it's worth mentioning here at the beginning why I draw so heavily on this concept. Liminality responds to the question of how to understand experience and is especially suited to the study of Qumran religious experience. In some ways, the Qumran group is an obvious choice for a study that employs the concept of liminality because of how easily the group's initiatory processes map onto Van Gennep's rites of passage, a process that consists of 3 phases: separation, liminality, and incorporation. In this model, liminal describes the center transitional phase that exists between 2 ordered poles or worlds. In an anthropological application of the concept to membership of the Qumran group, the liminal stage is the initiation period, when an individual has separated from the larger society, but is not yet fully joined to the group. However, this is hardly the only sense in which the concept of liminality resonates with ideas or practices articulated in the Qumran literature. The metaphors used to describe the group, references to its social structure, and its liturgical documents are replete with liminal imagery, suggesting that joining the group was itself tantamount to entering into a sort of liminal space. When we apply the concept of liminality to the study of the material, what emerges is a picture of a socio-religious group whose members perceive themselves in a liminal state of transition. Liminality is processual. In a successful rite of passage, participants pass through the liminal stage to arrive at a new reality. For members of the Qumran movement, initiation into the group was just the beginning. While it marked the completion of one type of transition, separating from broader Jewish society to become incorporated into the group, membership in the group was construed as a liminal experience. In other words, the completion of one liminal rite of passage, initiation into the group, effectively ushered the initiate into a liminal experience that is sometimes referred to as the last days, or the Acharit Hayamim in the Qumran literature. Qumran constructions of time trade heavily on this notion of the present as the last days and on the observance of sacred time. The liminal nature of the present is most pronounced in the Qumran constructions of the last days as a qualitatively distinct period that afforded members unprecedented access to divine realities through the regular cultivation of sacred time. According to the group's charter documents, ritual and liturgical activities intended to establish human divine communion were a hallmark of community life. This, combined with the large number of prayer texts and liturgical material preserved in the caves, attests to a robust religious experience in which communion with the divine permeated every part of life, infusing even more mundane activities with a sense of sacred purpose. The authors of the Qumran literature regularly invoke events and images from the past to construct a present last days period that is distinct from other temporalities, a sort of alternate reality unconstrained by the boundaries of other times. Constructing history in this way established the time of the group as the time in which eschatological activity was expected and enacted. This image of the last days as a distinct temporality stands in contrast to the two-age dualism so prevalent in discussions of early Jewish and Pauline eschatology. It also created a liminal experience of the present in which the practice of sacred time likely took on additional significance. In my study of the practice of sacred time at Qumran, I found evidence of both its regular and frequent practice. The group's concern with the calendar and observance of annual festivals, along with indications of frequent and even extended periods of prayer and worship throughout the day and night cycle, attest to the dominance of sacred time in Qumran religious experience, and even the degree to which it would have permeated every aspect of life. The result of this sort of experience is that all times become sacred to some degree, so the worshiper is suspended almost permanently in sacred time. The group's constructions of space likewise contribute to this sort of experience of the present as a liminal space. In this study, I considered how both physical, geographical spaces and conceptual or imaginal spaces would have contributed to an experience of the present as liminal for members of the Qumran group. In the modern world, physical geographical space is commonly associated with the idea of bounded space, space that is tangible, measurable, and determinable. It's often synonymous with notions of limits and boundaries, with limits implying restriction or serving as a sort of impenetrable boundary. However, as Arpad Zakolsai and others from the field of liminal studies would argue, in the ancient world, the limit was not an impenetrable boundary, but a separating device, inseparable from the idea of actually going through the limit. This view, that the limit is penetrable, is evident in Qumran constructions of space. It is through initiation, passing through a limit, that an individual assumes the group identity and finds himself at the limit of a strictly earthly human form of existence, poised to take up residence among the angels in a new transformed state. Passing through one liminal situation, initiation, ultimately leads the initiate into a social space defined by liminality. Drawing on evidence from the Hodayot and the community rule, I argue that the special knowledge acquired through membership granted the Qumran covenanter a degree of access to the divine that was not widely available. This meant that certain forms of knowledge must be restricted to those individuals who had proven themselves worthy. Only full initiates were instructed in the secret teachings of the group, since access to this knowledge was granted the covenanter, both the ability to commune with angels in the present and share in the common lot and eternal destiny with these holy ones. This, along with some degree of physical or geographical separation, served as a means of preserving the purity and integrity of the group. Located approximately 22 miles east of Jerusalem and situated just west of the Dead Sea, the settlement of Khirbet Qumran stands apart from other Jewish settlements of the same period in regard to its location and design. By establishing high levels of expectation regarding ritual purity, the group cultivated a geographical space fit for worship and communion with heavenly beings. In addition to the settlement, I discuss how the wilderness and Damascus function as conceptual categories that indicate the liminal nature of the group's physical geographical spaces, as sites of divine access and safe havens from places of punishment. These conceptual geographical categories identified the physical places of the membership as the locus of God's presence on earth. According to the group's logic, this combination of its exclusivist social space and its separation or its separate geographical space together established a liminal site for divine activity. The liminal nature of the group is expressed in some of the terms used to describe its communal identity. In the Qumran literature, the group is referred to as a human sanctuary and an eternal planting, images that illustrate the significance of communal identity for the covenanter's personal transformation. A related image that appears, that of the worshiper as sacrifice in the community rule, even paints a picture of the covenanter as already embodying a transitional state on account of his membership in the group. While the group's construction of the present as the last days drew the bounds of eschatological activity into the time and space of the group, and membership provided access to the knowledge that would unlock these realities, it was through ritual performance that this sort of communion might be achieved and still anticipated eschatological events would be realized. Liminal spaces are sites of unlimited potential. Within a liminal context, rituals tend to carry more weight as a potent backdrop increases their perceived effectiveness. It is from this perspective that I argue that the longer liturgies of the group were intended to do more than facilitate an experience of liturgical communion, a communion between human worshipers and angelic beings experienced in the time of worship. Through the performance of these liturgies, members sought to enact a new reality, hasten eschatological events still anticipated, and achieve the transformation necessary for permanent heavenly dwelling. In my analysis of the Cave 1 copy of the Hodayot, 1QH, I found that the arrangement of hymns form a liturgical progression that, when performed in sequence, enact the worshipper's transformation and heavenly elevation. The self-glorification hymn placed near the end of the sequence of hymns is best understood, at least in 1QH, as part of this liturgical progression. From this evidence, I concluded that 1QH might have functioned as a type of technology designed to transform the worshiper into a divine or glorified being fit for heavenly habitation. Through the implantation of God's Spirit, the speaker or member undergoes an ontological transformation that equips him with the material necessary to complete the process and achieve a permanent status among the angels. Liminal imagery in the hymns, in the center unit, indicates that until the process is complete, the individual remains in a precarious position, like a ship at sea, a woman in labor, and a city under siege. And yet, membership in the group and identification with its eternal nature offers some assurance of a successful outcome, as revealed in the image of the eternal plant sprouting into a cosmic world tree. The completion of this process of ontological transformation that equips an individual for heavenly dwelling is illustrated in the third and final unit of hymns by a proliferation of light imagery and the elevation of the speaker in the self-glorification hymn to a permanent place among the angels. The knowledge and insight implanted in the speaker by God become a source of eschatological light emanating from him at the culmination of his transformation into a glorified being. I suggest that through the form of liturgical progression evident in 1QH, the performance itself would have served as a means of negotiating the liminal state and enacting the transformation necessary for divinization. Though less personal than the Hodayot in orientation, two other long liturgies associated with the group exhibit a concern with eschatological communion and the actualization of still anticipated eschatological events. The Cave 1 War Scroll and the Songs of the Sabbath Sacrifice facilitated a type of human divine communion in the time of the group that was already eschatological in nature and sought to hasten or bring about the annihilation of wickedness and secure the covenanter's investiture into the heavenly priesthood. Regarding the War Scroll, I concluded that the performance of the text was a means through which participants might wage war liturgically and exhibit some agency over the outcome of the anticipated eschatological war against the sons of darkness. Speech and writing functioned as modes of performance intended to powerfully enact the defeat of Belial and annihilation of wickedness. Even the act of writing itself, inscribing the victory of the sons of light, was a way to ensure their success. And by following the script, which was in this case the manual, ritual performers might enact the defeat of the enemy with a force intended to draw that still future event into the present. Through prayers and blessings, participants declare God's victory, recalling images of God's past military action and calling on God to rise up and act powerfully now on their behalf. Like 1QH, the arrangement of the Cave 1 War Scroll creates a sense of progression and intensification that works to transform the participant. In the concluding portions of the text, Belial is defeated, and an influx of light imagery signals the permanent heavenly incorporation of the redeemed, the covenant community, into the lot of God. I found that a similar progression of events is evident in the songs of the Sabbath sacrifice, even though the focus is on the heavenly worship and the human participants' elevation to the ranks of the heavenly priesthood. Although the text is fragmentary, there is a discernible progression that includes a reference to eschatological war at a critical juncture. On the one hand, it's somewhat surprising that war is mentioned at all in this collection of liturgical songs that are otherwise totally enraptured with the worship of the angelic priesthood. On the other hand, it fits with a pattern found also in the Cave 1 copies of the Hodayot and the War Scroll, in which eschatological war precedes an inundation of divine light, signaling the defeat of Belial and the eradication of wickedness, and the covenanter's permanent incorporation into God's realm. In 1QH, a liturgy concerned primarily with the worshipper's ontological transformation, references to the defeat of evil spirits, the annihilation of wickedness, and the eschatological judgment of human and divine beings appear in the columns just before the self-glorification hymn. In the War Scroll, the focus is entirely on the eschatological war, with a brief depiction near the end of the covenanter's union with the angels, whereas the reverse is the case for the songs of the Sabbath sacrifice. Reference to eschatological war in the Songs liturgy appears just before the worshipper's entry into the heavenly temple in Songs 6 through 8. The inclusion of these events, eschatological war followed by heavenly incorporation in 1QH, 1QM, and the Songs, reveals the degree to which this sequence became ingrained in Qumran eschatology. Equally significant is that they appear in extended liturgies. As part of a complex web of ritual and liturgical activity, these three liturgies would have worked together to perform the covenanter's ontological transformation, to enact the eschatological defeat of Belial and the annihilation of wickedness, and to achieve the permanent incorporation into God's realm. Considering the treatment of eschatological war as a still future event in the Qumran literature, it seems most reasonable to conclude that the covenanters did not think they were already transformed permanent residents of God's realm. However, the construction of a liminal present, combined with liminal transitional identity and liturgies designed to complete the process of transformation, suggests that they believed the process was already well underway and nearing completion, and that they had some agency in affecting the anticipated outcome. Yet while this likely represents the group's general outlook, it does not preclude a belief that certain exemplary figures might attain heavenly incorporation before the completion of final eschatological events. The eye of the self-glorification hymn may in fact attest to this belief. There was indeed already a precedent for such exceptions in the examples of Enoch and Elijah, figures who were well known and esteemed in early Judaism, as their prominence among the collection of Qumran scrolls attests. The Apostle Paul in the New Testament might have even considered himself an exception to the general rule. Like the Qumran writers, Paul's understanding of the present as liminal hinges on the identification of a relatively recent event, for Paul, Christ's resurrection, as the inauguration of this last days period, and a belief that at least one major eschatological event, the defeat of death, still lies in the future. In between these two poles is a transitional liminal space in which the person who joins with Christ undergoes a radical ontological transformation through an infusion of Christ's pneuma. When Paul's views of pneumatic infusion are brought into conversation with Qumran notions of transformation, they appear less wild or unorthodox. Rather, drawing on the wisdom and technology of their day, together they represent a segment of Palestinian Judaism that in the first centuries BCE and CE conceptualized themselves as already becoming like the angels, even as they awaited or sought to enact the final events that would make permanent their position among them. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, Rebecca. Very, very interesting. Lots of interesting stuff going on there. Again, if anybody has any questions for Rebecca, please put them in the chat and we'll get to them at the end when we do the Q&A. In the meantime, we'll move on to our final speaker for today, Rachel Patt. Rachel received a Shohet in 2022. She is assistant professor of art history at the University of Notre Dame. She received her PhD from Emory University in 2022 with a focus on the material and visual culture of ancient Rome. Her research focuses broadly on forms of artistic production outside of painting, sculpture, and architecture in the Roman Empire and late antiquity. Her research has been supported by a number of organizations, including the ICS, and she is presently at work on a monograph on intimate forms of Roman portraiture. Her presentation today is titled Portraits and Pothos in the Premodern Mediterranean, a work in progress report. Okay, Rachel, the floor is yours.
Okay, I will go ahead and share my screen. Let's see. Okay, well, good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, depending on where you're joining us from. Thank you all for being here, and thank you to Arthur for that introduction and also for the invitation to speak to you all today on Zoom. I'm really just delighted to be here. And I wanted to take a minute to echo some of what Greg and Rebecca have already said about their sentiments concerning the support from the ICS. I really appreciated the grant and its impact, both in terms of the flexibility to which some people have already alluded, but also in terms of building community. I just started here at Notre Dame, and on a personal note, the welcome that I have received from the outgoing president of the ICS, Robin Jensen, has just been tremendous, and I really appreciate that and the possibility of that from my involvement with the ICS. So kind of wanted to mention, you know, the community building aspects of getting involved with this grant program. Okay, so all of that being said, as Arthur mentioned, I held a Shohet Scholars Grant the academic year of 2022 to 2023 for my current book project on aspects of portraiture in the pre-modern Mediterranean. And what I thought I'd do in the course of this presentation is to tell you a bit about the trajectory of that project, how the Shohet allowed me to make some crucial progress, and where the project currently stands. So let's get going. My book project has its roots in my doctoral dissertation, which I completed at Emory and submitted in the spring of 2022. The dissertation, meaning Materiality and Pothos in Late Antique Gold Glass Portraiture, took the exploration of Pothos, or the longing desire for an absent loved one, as a point of departure for investigating an understudied type of Roman portraiture, the gold glass roundel. The first half of the dissertation focused on extracting a corpus of 18 gold glass portraits from the much larger body of objects surviving from antiquity, known as gold sandwich glass, named after its technique of manufacture. Here I show you just a few examples of what that much more common material looks like, as opposed to the portraits on which I focused. Subsequent chapters of the dissertation then situated this corpus within the contexts of the exquisite portrait miniature, a tradition reaching back to the Hellenistic period, and to contemporarily executed portraits sculpted in marble. To give you a sense of the scale of the gold glass portraits, here's one of them now located in Torino in the palm of my hand. The second half of the dissertation employed the corpus that I gathered as a vehicle for exploring ancient portraiture more broadly. After introducing Pothos and exploring how Romans conceived of the portrait image, I turned to the aesthetic and material qualities of the gold glass portraits. The dissertation considered how the portraits harnessed particular aesthetic qualities to transform into powerful animated images equipped with the agency to mitigate yearning. And I concluded the dissertation by considering 3 types of afterlives of the gold glass roundels. Their eventual placement in the Roman catacombs, and here's the one that still remains in situ today. The role of Pothos in Byzantine image theory, and the longevity of the small-scale portrait format. So all of this was well and good for a dissertation, but I knew when it came to writing my first book that I wanted to expand my scope of inquiry beyond just the corpus of 18 portraits for a few key reasons. I wanted to reach an audience that would be invested in more than just this particular slice of gold sandwich glass. And I felt that an indispensable means of doing so would be through the concept of longing that had been so critical to my interpretation of the gold glass portraits, for that concept transcends the one body of material. In Book 35 of the Natural History, Pliny the Elder recounts the catalyst for creating the very first portrait as the imminent separation of a potter's daughter from her lover. At the core of the invention of portraiture, perhaps the format most strongly associated with Roman artistic innovation, was this sensation of yearning, of longing for someone absent. 2 millennia after Pliny, the notion of Pothos as a chief motivator for the creation of a portrait image still resonates. And it is with this lens towards interpreting portraits and later icons in the pre-modern Mediterranean in mind that I set out to shape the scope of my book project. The Shohet thus came at a critical juncture while I was grappling with how to define the contours of a book that drew conceptually from my doctoral work, but certainly was not a carbon copy of the dissertation. The grant enabled extensive travel during the first year of my postdoctoral fellowship at Princeton University's Center for Hellenic Studies to see collections of Roman portraits and Byzantine icons that were instrumental in shaping the final scope of my monograph. Most of this travel was in Europe, along with one briefer domestic trip. The grant underwrote stays in Copenhagen, where I visited 5 museums, Berlin, where I visited 9 museums, Florence, where I visited 4, Rome, where I visited 3 collections, and London, where I visited 8 museums, as well as a substantial stay in Greece, mostly centered in Athens and its environs, and that short domestic trip that I mentioned, which was to the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston. A major activity of mine during these travels, in addition to seeing primary source material in museum collections, was to meet with as many leading scholars in the community and a few emerging scholars with pertinent research interests to mine to discuss my project with them, gain feedback, and solicit more general advice on succeeding in academia. I really cannot underscore enough how important the opportunity was. By having the chance to meet with scholars and gain feedback on the project at this stage, I was able to reframe it into 6 body chapters, each anchored in a single portrait from the ancient world and early Byzantium, to give its argumentative arc and objects-rooted focus. This was a fairly radical but a much-needed shift from the 9-chapter project I had proposed for my postdoc, But as an emerging scholar, I had a thing or two to learn from those more established about what is actually feasible for a good first monograph, the kinds of manuscripts that academic presses are willing to support and to publish, and what might be best to consider in future lines of research. So now I'd like to tell you a bit more about where I landed for the project, which I'm now titling Intimate Encounters, Memory, Pothos, and Portraiture in the Premodern Mediterranean. Intimate Encounters traces the role Pothos played from the birth of Western portraiture to pre-iconoclastic Byzantium. The first and last of its chapters frame the discussion around portraits that exist only in the literary tradition and in the cultural imagination. The first is anchored in that Plinian anecdote that I've already referenced, and which we see imagined here in this painting by Joseph Wright of Derby, now in the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. A young woman, the daughter of a potter in ancient Corinth by the name of Boutades, is troubled at the prospect of the imminent departure of her beloved. While he sleeps before setting out for his journey, she traces his silhouette on the wall in lamplight, and Boutades fills in this outline with the clay with which he practices his trade. The potter then fires this impression in his kiln, to which Wright gestures here at the right edge of the composition. This is the first portrait. While Pliny does not claim Pothos outrightly as the catalyst for the birth of portraiture, this chapter argues that the prospect of separation and the painful emotions entailed therein indeed did. The chapter introduces the reader to Pothos by situating it within its philosophical and iconographical contexts. And here I'm showing you just a few of the ancient representations of the god Pothos that I saw on my Shohet travels. In addition, in articulating Pothos's related yet distinct nature from perhaps more familiar terms such as eros and philia, along with storge and himeros, and in analyzing corresponding terms in the Latin language, I investigate ancient formulations of love, grief, and longing and set the stage for connecting these emotions to my larger art historical inquiry on portraiture. The next 4 chapters are all rooted in material portraits rather than the verbal portrait that Pliny offers us, which Boutades made. The second chapter turns to looking at a plaster mortuary mold and an ancient impression derived from one such mold excavated at Thysdrus, Tunisia, that's modern-day El Jem, to analyze the role that memory played in the function of Roman portraiture. So here I'm showing you the case as they're displayed in the museum today. And here is a plaster mortuary mold of a man's face. This is an ancient plaster casting taken from a mold of a woman. These rare and remarkable objects are hitherto almost entirely unpublished, especially in English, and invite explorations on the nature of presence, absence, and the status of an image itself. The chapter begins by connecting the molds to ancient approaches to memory and the senses rooted in metaphors of imprinting and sealing. It then traces out the relationship between the Roman portrait and imago, or wax ancestral mask, a form entrenched in societal memory-making practices. By situating Roman portraits within the context of rhetorical treatises such as Cicero's and Quintilian's, I demonstrate how the highly pictorial formulation of rhetoric resulted in intensely powerful associations between image and the activation of memory. This allowed for portraits to conjure the presence of loved ones, thereby providing a relief to the Pothos experienced by beholders. Drawing on Georges Didier Huberman on imprinting in the negative, Hans Belting on the nature and production of presence, and especially Jacques Derrida on impressing, printing, and memory making, the chapter uses these mortuary molds to juxtapose the highly philosophical conception of the Roman portrait image with the raw emotional response that accompanies loss and how to make manifest materially ancient ideas about the nature of memory. The third chapter centers on a rock, crystal, and gold ring from Grottaferrata, Italy, to explore the link between scale and intimacy, to investigate interactions between ancient beholders and portraits, and to probe how such portraits could materialize mourning. The virtually unpublished ring is almost without material parallels and is all the more extraordinary because it comes from a documented excavation that allows for a deeply poignant reading of the relationship between Ibutia Quarta, its owner, and her deceased son, the subject of the portrait in the ring, Titus Carelius Gemellus. Drawing on Susan Stewart's groundbreaking work on the miniature, I argue that small-scale portraits provided particularly consoling surrogates for the absent beloved because of the ways in which their smallness facilitated the production of intimacy. Incorporating accounts of exquisite portrait miniatures by writers such as Caraton and Ovid, this chapter takes on the trope of the love of images to nuance the incredulity that stories like that of Pygmalion often provoke. Instead, I assert that portraits such as the Grottaferrata ring mitigated Pothos through their materiality to provide intimate, immediate surrogates for the portrayed individual. Plotinus wrote of a profound sense of merging and coalescing in mystical vision as, quote, another kind of seeing, a giving oneself over and pressing towards contact with the sought-after divine. In doing so, he illustrates an alternative visuality to the pursuit of mimesis that dominates modern conversations on classical art's aesthetic ambitions. The fourth chapter argues that by interrupting expectations of mimesis and offering instead a direct visual confrontation imbued with wonder, enchantment, and alterity, the small group of gold glass portraits I focused on in my dissertation, roughly contemporary to Plotinus, potently bridged the gap between beholder and beloved. Situating them within discourses on agency, response, and the poles of visuality, this chapter offers a novel analysis of these technically astonishing portraits to demonstrate that they mitigated Pothos through their materiality. While taking Alfred Gell on agency as a critical point of departure, the chapter remains grounded in classical antiquity by evaluating the portraits through the lens of thinkers like Philostratus, Lucian, and Galen, in addition to Plotinus. So the fifth chapter of the book project takes us out of Italy and to Egypt to consider the painted panel portraits inserted into mummy wrappings. I'm showing you details of two here. Since their discovery in the late 19th century, much has been made of the formal and technical affinities between these Roman Egyptian portrait panels and encaustic icons. As early as 1900, some scholars have argued that the mummy portraits were the direct predecessors of Byzantine icon painting, such as, of course, these famous early icons from Sinai. The fifth chapter takes the portrait of the freed slave Eutyches as its anchor to do something quite different. It asks the question of what happens when the portrait that serves to soothe the sensation of longing is rendered inaccessible, buried below the earth's surface. It thereby complicates the proposal regarding portraits as intimate stand-ins for the absent beloved. With the distance entirely collapsed between the individual depicted in the portrait and his physical remains, the absence here is not of a body, but of a life. The chapter looks to the cult of relics that emerged in late antiquity as a parallel in which visual signifiers of meaning are concealed from view, in this case by containment in reliquaries. Both mummy portraits and relics engage in issues of access, fragmentation, and presence, and a consideration of relics and their reliquaries in tandem with Roman Egyptian mummy portraits offers an innovative means of interpreting a class of objects so often only treated in catalogs and technical studies and segregated from larger conversations about the nature of Roman portraiture. To wrap up, I return to the realm of a portrait that really only exists for us in words. In his 7th century biography of John Chrysostom, Patriarch George I of Alexandria recorded an episode that occurred during the saint's writing practice. John Chrysostom deeply admired St. Paul, and when immersed in drafting a homily on the saint's letters, hung a portrait of him on the wall of his Constantinopolitan study. And you can see that at the top of this manuscript image. John Chrysostom engaged it actively in conversation and in questioning. On 3 consecutive nights, his secretary Proclus witnessed a vision of St. Paul himself whispering into the writer's ear, and that's the scene depicted here in this leaf of a manuscript. The portrait of Paul as powerful mediator of presence and as stand-in for a beloved in a Christian context serves as a point of entry for this chapter's consideration of the continuities between classical and Byzantine image making, which I contend are rooted in Pothos. Past scholars have looked to numerous visual sources as the cradle of the Byzantine icons, such as imperial images and the aforementioned Roman Egyptian mummy portraits, but here I'm offering a conceptual alternative, that the powerful currents of desire and longing for an absent beloved, whether mortal, saintly, or divine, motivated the production of likenesses that served to trigger memory, to facilitate relationships, and to soothe the ache induced by absence. Drawing on the writings of treatises such as that of John of Damascus and epigrams by courtly poets, the chapter demonstrates the deep heritage of the icon in the classical private portrait tradition that began with Buttati's daughter. Here, by means of conclusion, I'm just going to give you this wonderful mosaic from Antioch in which the depicted individual is contemplating a handheld portrait. So ultimately, Intimate Encounters suggests that Pothos permeated modes of Byzantine image production as a form of influential conceptual heritage from antiquity. Animated by a universal experience, we all have missed loved ones, that has gained increasing urgency as we grapple with the aftermath of the global pandemic, the book project stakes out new ground for greater dialogue between considerations of the classical portrait and the Byzantine icon, while also encouraging a more expansive understanding of Roman portraiture through different considerations of media, scale, and context that transcend our expectations of sculpted, monumental, and public images. Yet Intimate Encounters argues for more than just this complementary history of Roman portraiture and Byzantine image making. In taking up these larger transtemporal questions, such as the nature of presence and the contested narration within Western art history of the transition from portrait to icon, I'm hoping to offer a sweeping new history of the very idea of representation, grounded in absence and desire. The larger book manuscript is still being completed, but the first publication stemming from this line of inquiry supported by the Shohet Scholars Grant was published in the March 2024 issue of the Art Bulletin. Okay, sorry. I lost my place for a second. The Fragility of Solace, Pothos and Memory in Late Roman Gold Glass Portraiture introduces my contention that Pothos was a major conceptual catalyst informing the creation and development of the genre of portraiture in ancient Rome, while focusing on a tightly concentrated set of objects. A second article related to these gold glass portraits was published in the American Journal of Archaeology's April 2024 issue. So big spring for gold glass portraits, if you're interested in these things. I'm very grateful for the opportunities that the Shohet Scholars Grant afforded me at this early stage in my career. To have a chance to see a really huge quantity of museum collections, examine objects, and carefully reflect on my monograph project is a tremendous privilege for an early career scholar. As I get settled into this next stage of my career as an assistant professor here at Notre Dame, I very much am looking forward to completing the manuscript and to seeing it through to publication, and to continuing to have the chance to do what I love for a living, thinking about ancient Roman and late antique art. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Rachel. Very, very interesting. All right, so we do have some time for questions, and I see some questions in the chat, so I will hand things over to Nicola, and she will moderate the Q&A.
Thank you very much, Arthur. And I really want to start by just congratulating the three presenters for the outstanding quality of your scholarship. I know that we as a jury were very impressed with these applications, and our decision to fund your projects are that much given that much more weight, and we feel that much better about it listening to these presentations. So it's just fantastic to hear what you've been working on and to know that we've been a good positive part of that. I think it's a fantastic scholarship as well. It's just such a great thing to have the freedom that this money gives you to pursue what it is you're passionate about and to produce really high quality work. So again, it's very affirming for me and just really warms my heart. So thank you again for these presentations. I think I'd like to start by asking people if there are questions from, live questions that you haven't yet put in the chat. We do have a few of those, and so we'll come to those, but I'm aiming for about, we'll see, 15, 20 minutes worth of questions at this point, and I know some people might need to get going. So if there's anybody who has something, that they're bursting to say right now, a question to ask, now is the time, opening the floor for that first. Don't all come crowding in at once with all your questions. Okay, fine, fair enough. So the first question, actually, first comment that we have here is from Anavis, who wants to ask a little bit, presumably for Greg, yes, about the testimony of Eusebius in the Historia Ecclesiastica. So, Anavis, what directly was your question or comment here?
Yeah, sorry, I didn't mention Greg because I didn't know what the format was, but
Yes,
that
that's fine.
was for Greg. Because I'm very interested in the episcopal primacy, so in which you engaged in modern times, but I'm also interested in the episcopal primacy of the Bishop of Caesarea. And so I just looked up the chapter and verse of his passage where he discusses Ignatius. And first of all, it's very interesting to me that I have studied quotations a lot, that Eusebius starts here with logos de echi. Word has it, the story goes. So that means that he perhaps doesn't have a text available. And so, and when you just continue to read the passage about to which churches Ignatius wrote, and he mentions indeed those churches, Ephesus, Magnesia, Tralles, Troas, etc. But what he does is he mentions those churches and the bishop in these churches. So that was for him much more important, apparently, than Ignatius. So then at one point, when he comes to Rome, he has a quotation. And so that's one part. And then he goes on with Troas and what is it, Philadelphia, Smyrna. And then he has also a kind of quotation, but not very much. So that's it for Eusebius. And at the end, he says, well, Irenaeus also agrees with that. So he needs a little bit of extra support. So do you think that Eusebius had any of these letters available? Or how do people, I'm sure that people have researched this extensively. How do people see this?
I mean, I think the typical understanding is, yes, that Eusebius had access to the 7 letters that he mentions, and certainly had access at least to the letter to the Romans, which he gives this extensive quotation from, and that's the earliest sort of external to the letters itself, earliest attestation of that big chunk. So it's not like Eusebius, as far as we know, is getting that from somewhere else. What I will say is that, you know, the Logos Deche at the beginning of this section has stood out to me as well, and does, I think, suggest that Eusebius's fitting of Ignatius into the story that he's telling is if not necessarily a creative act by Eusebius, certainly a choice that he's making to kind of plug the story that has been told into the narrative, the broader narrative that he is telling. You're right, he is particularly attentive to the bishops that that Ignatius is potentially corresponding and interacting with. He's also especially interested in the topography, you know, that Ignatius has traveled over. He groups the clusters of letters as he mentions them by where Ignatius is writing from, you know, in each of these letters. And so to answer your question, what most scholars do with this, most of scholars in, you know, of the past 400 years or so, have assumed that Eusebius had before him a 7-letter collection that was arranged in precisely the way that he is relaying. And so oftentimes, if somebody has attempted to present a kind of coherent reading of the earliest known version of the letters of Ignatius, they're presuming a ordering of the letters that follows the order that the letters are mentioned by Eusebius. None of the manuscripts that I showed give such an order. And I think the overarching kind of narrative interest of Eusebius and the topographical interest of Eusebius certainly is enough of a, you know, kind of reason why he might rearrange the letters that are known to him, if in fact all of the letters are known to him, as you know, sort of raise the question, Your Honor. But the other thing that is done, and this is done very explicitly by Joseph Barber Lightfoot, you know, probably most with the biggest impact in the late 19th century, is essentially establishing that the middle recension text, as it is reconstructed by Lightfoot, following on Usher and others, is the very text that Eusebius has before him. And then thereby the text that, because Eusebius is attesting to it, and Eusebius is claiming that Polycarp and Irenaeus knew of it, therefore this is the original text that was there back in the early 2nd century. And essentially collapsing the distance between, you know, Trajan and Eusebius, and saying that the corpus must have stayed the same through all that time. You know, I'm making in my work kind of precisely the opposite assumption, which is to say, if it's clear enough that the letter collection was being rewritten and reshuffled in various ways after Eusebius, then it seems just as plausible that it was being rewritten and reshuffled in various ways before Eusebius. And there's no reason to presume stability between the 2nd and 4th centuries.
Okay, that's very nice. Thank you.
Thank you. And Greg, there's another question for you here, which is in the chat, and this is from Hassan Derli. How has Ignatius, his martyrdom been perceived by Coptic tradition? The Gnostic perspective generally holds a negative view of martyrdom. Coptic Christianity has also produced a rich body of literature and heritage related to martyrdom. So he writes, I'm curious about how Ignatius's appreciation for martyrdom was understood and interpreted within Coptic Christianity.
I have not found a lot of discussion of Ignatius's martyrdom as such, or Ignatius in Coptic literature, and I'll be the first to admit that the later Coptic literature, you know, medieval, early modern, contemporary Coptic literature, I don't have a great knowledge of, and so I'm sure that there's all sorts of traditions and, you know, the contemporary Arabic Coptic church that I just don't have, you know, access to in my current work. But at least if we go to the versions of the letters as are extant in the White Monastery collection, the 10th, 11th century manuscripts that are the extant ancient versions of the letters of Ignatius in Coptic, as far as we have access to them. There are two versions, and they're both highly fragmentary. We don't have any other texts from that collection or from earlier than then that are discussing Ignatius or mentioning Ignatius, aside from a highly fragmentary version of the Acts of Ignatius's martyrdom. And so the best that we can do to try and get a sense of how readers were interpreting Ignatius and his martyrdom in that particular context of Coptic Christianity, and, you know, by the 10th or 11th century, is just noting the differences between the Coptic version, so much as we can see of it, and the Greek version. This is something that I tried to track in the article that I mentioned that I published coming out of this this award. And to speak to particularly this question, one particular interest is that Ignatius does talk quite a bit about suffering. As anybody who has read the letters of Ignatius, or you know, read Judith Perkins' work on martyrdom and Ignatius through that. And one of the interesting things is that all of the in all of the cases where we have a parallel Greek Middle Recension text and the Coptic translation of some version of that same text, in all the cases where Ignatius is talking about suffering, the Coptic is instead talking about death. And it seems to shift and focalize the culmination of the martyrdom that Ignatius is envisioning, instead of the sort of suffering process, you know, that is leading to that culmination. And so there are some subtle changes and emphasis there in the extant text as far as I've been able to study them, but I'm sure there is much more, you know, in the later Coptic tradition that I just haven't had an opportunity to access.
Wonderful. Greg, there's another question for you from Mikhail Berg, but what I would like to do is go, because Joan has a question for Rebecca, well, to get a chance for Rebecca to get a question, and then I will come back and pick up Mikhail's question, which is an interesting one that I'd like to hear the answer to as well. So moving on to Rebecca, Joan says, could you say a little bit more about the layout of space within Qumran and how it fits into the liminal character you outlined for initiates there? For example, in your work, do you take into account various dividers found within the Qumran site, like the long wall that separates the main space from the cemetery or the presence of a mikveh? I would love to hear your thoughts a bit more about the physical layout of the site as sacred or secular, or liminal, etc.
Thank you. Thank you for this question, Joan. Yes, absolutely. I think the layout at Qumran and the presence of mikveyot at strategic locations also speaks to this real concern with maintaining a sort of constant state of ritual purity that would have gone above and beyond what most people probably practiced at that time, at least based on, I'm going kind of on the archaeological evidence that's discussed by Jody Magnus and Ronnie Reich. Jody Magnus does quite a bit with the layout of the community and points out that on the eastern side, we tend to see more spaces that would be associated with ritual impurity. Things like the workshop, the toilet, the cemetery is just outside the eastern wall. And it's interesting, or at least I found it interesting, that the largest mikveh is located right there at the southeastern entrance as well. And then there's some smaller mikveh, or what are assumed to be mikvehot, that are also in that region. And then on the western side, Magnus has also pointed out that there are spaces that seem to be more associated with things that would require greater levels of purity. The dining halls, possibly a meeting room, what maybe a scriptorium is also in that region. And then, of course, there are mikvehot that are outside of the dining halls and in areas where, as we read the literature in conjunction with the site, where it seems to be expected that they would be maintaining higher levels of purity to participate in certain activities. So yeah, I do think the site itself is designed in such a way that it was easier to access what was needed in order to maintain higher levels of purity, but also laid out in a way that maybe some spaces could be avoided if that was necessary as well. But yeah, I do think that the layout of the site contributes to this this goal of trying to maintain higher levels of ritual purity that the group required of itself.
Thank you, Rebecca.
Thank you.
A terrible cough right now. And also we have a question for Rachel here, actually from Arthur. Can you say more about the iconography of Pothos in the two statues you showed? How does the portraiture express the concept?
Sure. Yeah, so part of bringing in an examination of how Pothos is represented iconographically in that first chapter is really part of my goal of putting Pothos more on the map in terms of the scholarship, because there really hasn't been an extensive discussion of Pothos as opposed to some of these more widely recognized love words, eros, philia, etc., in art historical literature. There have been a few exceptions, including Ivan Derpich's 2016 book, but really this is not so much talked about. So what I wanted to do in that first chapter is just set the scene a bit, and that includes hammering out the details of the iconography, of the linguistic usages. And so the actual depiction of Pothos as this god, you might have noticed in the Uffizi, actually I think in both of them, there's a goose alongside the god. That's because he's part of, possibly predictably, right, the realm of Aphrodite Venus as one of these love figures. But there isn't so much, it's not that the depiction of Pothos as a god iconographically has to do with how that concept plays out in portraiture, if that makes sense. It was more about fleshing out this concept that's hitherto fairly little studied in ancient studies.
Thank you, Rachel.
All right. Returning now to Mikhail Berg's question for you, Greg. Do you think the early modern commentators and scholars are doing anything different as they utilize Ignatius or his letters for their understanding of the bishop? Or would you see all of the different recensions and versions as also utilizing Ignatius and his letters for their own purposes and theological struggles? If they are open letters, would the pre-modern recensions and translations represent different attempts to close them in their own contexts?
These are such fabulous questions. Thank you, Mikhail. They cut to, right to the kind of intersection that I alluded to between the two big questions that the book is trying to grapple with. That question of how do we arrive at this consensus understanding of a textual history that gives us the 7 authentic letters in the Apostolic Fathers, and then also how do we read the multitude of Ignatian traditions in a manner that's more in line with how pre-modern readers and who transmitted them would have understood them. These questions are really kind of getting at exactly the nexus between these two things. To answer the second question first, I do see all of the different recensions and versions as using Ignatius in his letters for their own purposes, often in the context of some kind of a theological struggle. Although I do want to add that I don't think that it's the case that all of the versions of the letters of Ignatius or the textual interventions in the different versions are attributable solely to theology or to theological polemic. I think that there is, some evidence that I could go into if we had more time, that there are narrative and aesthetic interests in some of these versions. There might be more kind of antiquarian interest. There are these sort of literary flourishes that crop up, especially in the long recension, that I don't think, can be entirely reduced to just like trying to kind of prosecute a theological point. The final question is one that is a great one. It gets at part of what is still the kind of bleeding edge with a lot of blood loss of what I'm trying to sort of figure out here, in terms of the work in progress, which is what can we learn about how ancient or pre-modern readers were conceptualizing these letter collections, when in many cases, most of what we have access to is just the different versions of these letter collections as reflected in the manuscripts, and not a kind of reception history where there's meta reflection on what's going on with these texts conceptually. I think that there is compelling evidence from the manuscripts themselves that most of what was going on in the transmission of this letter collection in pre-modernity was not an attempt to close the tradition, but attempts to modulate or add to a tradition that was understood to be open to such modulation or addition. And so the textual interventions in the Greek long recension in particular seem to be very closely intertwined and based on a really close reading of an earlier version of the letters, taking them very seriously as having a narrative force, for example, that whoever was adding to it was seeing themselves to be further elaborating. They're explicitly picking up on expanding the narrative that was already kind of incipient in an earlier version of the letters. I do think that the early modern scholars and commentators are doing something different, yet ironically, they're also doing something that is very similar. And this is kind of one of the, the kind of tensions here. What they think they're doing is different, I think. They are trying to, as I said earlier, fix these letters to a single stable form that they believe to be the kind of original or earliest attainable form. And so against a pre-modern transmission that seemed set on pluriformity and multiplicity, they're trying to take all of that and wrangle it back down to singularity and stability. Yet in doing that, they are ironically contributing to the pluriformity and multiplicity because they're then producing versions of this collection that never existed in the manuscripts, as far as we can tell, that are their own reconstructions and understandings of, what must have been there at the earliest time. So I think the early modern commentators and scholars certainly are trying to close the text, in a struggle with that kind of pluriformity. And I think that is part of why these were a particular bugbear in the development of philological methods from the 17th to the 19th centuries. But I'll leave it at that now. Thank you so much for the question.
Thank you. And Mikhail has, at the end here in the messages, given you a couple of responses, so take a look at those. We have about 4 or 5 more minutes. I'd like to kind of close it up at around 1/4 to the hour, and there are 2 more questions in here right now in the chat, both for Rachel. So I don't know whether you can maybe combine some of those answers, Rachel's, when you take a look. The first one from Carolyn Davidson. Have you any thoughts on whether the gold glass portraits inserted into ceiling slabs in the loculi in the catacombs were a representation of the person interred in the tomb? And so easing Pothos when the tomb was visited, or whether it was a final destination of an item that had been used to ease Pothos in everyday life and was then inserted into the ceiling slab of the tomb, right, of the person who had experienced this emotion. So therefore creating an eternal visual connection between the person interred and their loved one. And then Robin Jensen kind of asks her question about, can you say more about how the gold glass images of Peter and Paul could be incorporated into your thesis?
I will do this, yes, in about 3 or 4 minutes, or try. Thank you so much to both of you for your questions. With regards to the first one, yeah, so beginning when the catacombs were rediscovered in the early modern period, and most of the gold glass portraits that have an archaeological find spot, they are from the catacombs. But so it was a common theory that these were tomb markers, that they were the portrait of the person interred in that loculus. We've now come to understand, by looking at the whole of the decorative program of the individual oculi, but also the catacombs at large, and sort of what aesthetic features were being highlighted in them through the use of different materials and different sources of lighting, especially that this probably wasn't the case, that they were inserted into the plaster slabs as a secondary usage. And we, in fact, some of these gold glass portraits have inscriptions on them naming the depicted individual or depicted individuals. And those can be juxtaposed, right, with being set in a grave that has other epigraphic references to different individuals buried there. So we can see pretty clearly that there isn't a one-to-one correspondence, and that this was a secondary usage. Probably in the same line that other kinds of shimmering materials and precious materials like ivory, seashells, glass tesserae, all of these kinds of things were also immured in the plaster loculi coverings for, as different scholars have argued, aesthetic impact that would have had on the visitor coming to the catacombs, perhaps helping to mark out different spots, but certainly not signaling the exact individual buried therein. How am I doing on time? Okay, so Peter and Paul, I mean, yeah, maybe this is just something that you and I should have a conversation about over coffee one day, because the truth of the matter is that the representations of Saint Peter and Paul and the other early Christian saints, the martyrs on the 4th century gold glass, that group of material that is so much more the corpus of gold sandwich glass that survives. Again, that's about 500 pieces, and I have 18 portraits. I didn't really, integrate that right into the line of argumentation about portraiture. Now, is there room for these objects to surface, say, in that 6th chapter where I'm thinking about late antiquity, early Byzantium, the kind of continuity of the concept? Absolutely. And so I thank you for that question, and that should definitely be a conversation we continue. Thanks.
Thank you so much. I think I will turn things at this point back. Sorry, my cat is going crazy. Turn things back over to Arthur.
All right, thanks, Nicola. And I just want to echo what Nicola said earlier to all of our presenters today. It's just really a pleasure to hear about all this wonderful work that you're doing and that you've done. And we're just really happy as a society to have been able to support your work, especially in these early years of your career. So, anyone in our audience today, if you're, interested in learning more about the Shohet or thinking about applying, I think the next application deadline is coming up in January. I think January 15th is our usual deadline. And you can get more information on our website. You might also think about becoming a member of the Catacomb Society. There's information about that on our website as well, and that gives you access to just really a treasure trove of a digital image archive that we've amassed over the years, many of which are our personal photographs, those of us who have been affiliated with the society for a long time. So you might want to check that out as well. So thanks again to everyone for joining us today, to our presenters, to Nicola, to the other board members who are here with us today. And we look forward to seeing you at another future event of ours. Have a good rest of the day, everyone.